He was known only as Trace, a man who rode alone through dust storms and silence, with nothing but his saddle, his scars, and a name most folks whispered but never truly knew. He didn't look for trouble, didn't speak more than was needed, and slept under open skies like he was part of the land itself. But on one bitter cold evening, deep in the high country where even coyotes hesitated to howl, Trey saw something that stopped him cold. A girl, shivering near a dying fire, wrapped in nothing but moonlight and pride. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She just sat there, her eyes burning like coals in the dark, too proud to speak but too young to survive the night alone. Trace could have ridden past. He'd done it before. Help always came with strings, and strings had a way of tightening into nooses. But this time he dismounted. Quietly, without a word, he took his blanket, the only one he owned, and laid it over her shoulders. She didn't thank him. She just looked at him like she knew something he didn't. Then she closed her eyes, and he rode off into the night like a ghost in the wind. At dawn, everything changed. The sun rose red, casting long shadows across the valley. Trace was halfway through boiling coffee when he heard them. Hooves, heavy and many. 300 riders emerged from the tree line, faces painted, eyes locked. Not hostile, but determined. At their center, the girl from the fire. No longer alone. No longer silent. She pointed at Trace and spoke in a tongue older than the trail he rode. This man showed me honor. He covered me with his spirit. He is mine now. He is ours. Before Trace could speak, they dismounted. Not to fight, not to threaten, but to honor, to kneel, to call him something he had never expected to hear in his life. Husband. Not in the way white men meant it. Not with rings or contracts, but in the way of blood, fire, and bond. A union sealed by gesture, not by speech. And in that moment, the loner cowboy realized he'd crossed a line no map could mark. What he had given in silence had returned louder than thunder. He hadn't planned on saving anyone. He didn't think kindness would cost him his solitude. But in the West, the smallest acts echo the loudest. And sometimes, a simple blanket in the cold becomes a banner carried by 300 warriors. What Trace did wasn't heroic. It was human. And that, in a land that forgets humanity faster than it buries bones, was powerful enough to rewrite a man's fate. Trace had never belonged anywhere. Not to a town, not to a family, not to a tribe. He drifted from territory to territory like tumbleweed, free, forgotten, and just fine with that. His horse was his only companion, and his blanket was more of a second skin than a comfort. It had warmed him through mountain snows, dried him after river crossings, and covered the bruises left by fights he didn't start but never lost. That same blanket now rested on a girl he didn't know, and that one gesture, quiet, instinctive, had somehow tied him to 300 souls without warning. They didn't look at him with suspicion. They looked at him like they'd been expecting him all along. The elders stood tall, their faces marked with stories longer than any written in books. The warriors flanked him like brothers, and the girl, now dressed in ceremonial beads and soft leather, stood at his side as if she'd never been anywhere else. She hadn't changed who she was. She had simply stepped into the place the act had opened. And now, Trace was caught between the silence of his past and the storm of this new bond. He tried to ride away, not out of fear, but confusion. No man had ever called Trace husband. He didn't know the customs, didn't speak the language, didn't understand the weight of what he'd done. But as he packed his saddle, the girl stood in his path. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She simply placed her hand over her heart, then pressed it gently against his chest. "You didn't ride past," she said in broken English. "Now, you can't ride away." Her voice wasn't a plea. It was a truth. That night, they sat by the fire in a wide circle. No questions, no accusations, just stories. The tribe spoke of honor, of how sacred it was to offer warmth to someone in need, especially to a woman alone. They believed Trace had offered more than comfort. He'd offered his spirit, his protection, his name, even if he never meant to. And that, in their world, was not something undone with a goodbye. It was sacred, binding, eternal. Trace didn't understand it all, but he felt it. The way they looked at him, not as an outsider, but as someone chosen by the land itself. And as the drums beat low under the stars, he stared into the flames and saw his reflection for the first time. not in glass, not in water, but in the eyes of people who believed one act of compassion could shape destiny. And in the Old West, belief was sometimes more powerful than blood. In the days that followed, Trace tried to keep to himself. He mended gear, trained his horse, and avoided crowds, old habits that had once kept him alive. But everywhere he went, the people greeted him with quiet reverence. Children followed him like he was a wandering legend. Women smiled at him without expectation. The warriors offered him space, but never turned their backs. He wasn't their prisoner. He wasn't even a guest. He was something else now. A bond, a name carried not in paper, but in story. The girl's name was Nia. She told him this one morning as they gathered water at the river. She spoke in fragments, her English broken but thoughtful. Nia means sun after storm, she said. My mother named me after the fire passed through our home and spared only me. Trace didn't respond at first. He wasn't used to stories. But something in her voice cracked the hard shell of silence inside him. Trace ain't much of a name, he muttered. Just what was left of me when the rest got burned away. And for the first time, she smiled at him. Not out of pity, but recognition. That night, a feast was held under the stars. Not for ceremony, for kinship. Trace sat among them, unsure of what to do with his hands, his eyes, his heart. They passed him food, poured him drink, and shared laughter that felt older than language. The elders told tales of spirits who test men by placing lost women in their paths. Those who pass by remain men, one elder said. But those who stop become more. Trace didn't know what more meant, but he felt its weight settle in his bones like the coming of winter. As time moved like water over stone, Trace began to change without realizing. He rose with the tribe at dawn, helped repair shelters, learned the names of stars and animals. He taught the young boys how to mend saddles and sit quiet when stalking game. He never called himself husband, but the word followed him like a shadow, spoken with honor, not pressure. And Nia, she never asked for affection. She gave him presents. And somehow, that was louder than love. One evening, as Trace walked alone along the tree line, he heard a rustle. Not animal, not wind. A scout approached him, face grave. Riders coming, he said. 5, maybe 6. Town men. Trace didn't flinch. He knew that sound, that tension. He had lived on both sides of it. The past, it seemed, wasn't finished with him. And now, it would ride straight into a valley that had begun to call him one of its own. When the sun rose the next morning, the horizon didn't carry light, it carried dust. A thin brown line rolled like smoke across the ridge, stirred by the hooves of riders who didn't belong to the valley. Trace stood at the edge of camp, rifle across his shoulder, eyes narrowed. The warriors had gathered in silence behind him. No words were needed. They felt the shift. This wasn't a visit. It was a test. And in the West, tests never came without cost. The men who approached wore lawmen's coats, but had outlaw hearts. Trace recognized one of them. Boone Sutter, a bounty hunter who never cared if a man was guilty or just convenient. Years ago, Trace had ridden with him for a time, back when coin mattered more than conscience. Boone dismounted first, spitting into the dirt. Didn't expect to find you hiding behind beads and smoke, he drawled. You always did like playing the hero, Trace. His voice carried mockery, but his eyes flicked to the warriors, measuring, cautious. I'm not hiding, Trace said evenly. I'm home. The word surprised even him. But once it left his mouth, he didn't want it back. Boone scoffed, drawing a yellowed poster from his coat. You got a price again. For riding with renegades. For turning your back on the law. He waved the paper in the air. Dead or alive. Trace didn't flinch. He glanced at Nia, who had stepped forward without fear. You call us renegades, she said softly. But we never left our home. You just forgot it was yours, too. Tension cracked like dry wood. The warriors gripped their spears tighter. The townsmen rested hands on holsters. But Trace raised one palm, not to plead, but to decide. You want to drag me back to the dust, he said to Boone. Then you'll have to answer to them. And to me. I ain't the man you rode with. I'm the man who stayed. For a moment, the silence thickened, pulsing like a heartbeat. Then Boone laughed once, short, mean, and mounted up. This ain't over, he said. This land'll eat you alive. And with that, they rode off, trailing dust and unfinished business. That night, Trace sat alone beneath the stars, sharpening his knife with steady hands. Nia approached, kneeling beside him. "They'll come back," she said. "With more." He nodded. "I know." She reached for his hand, not to comfort, but to anchor. "We don't run." Trace looked at her, his voice low. "I've done enough running for one lifetime." And as the fire crackled nearby and shadows danced across the earth, the loner cowboy knew, for the first time, that he had something worth staying for, and something worth standing against. In the days that followed, the valley prepared, not with fear, but with purpose. Trace taught the younger warriors how to defend in open terrain, how to anticipate movement by dust, how to set warning traps without leaving a mark. They listened to him, not because he barked orders, but because they felt the weight of his experience. He was no longer just a man who covered a girl with a blanket. He was a shield now, forged by fire and tempered by choice. The elders gathered by the sacred stone near the heart of camp, whispering to the spirits and marking the ground with ash. They believed that land could remember, and that it would remember how the tribe once fought not just for their lives, but for their place in a world that tried to erase them. Trey stood with them, silent, respectful. He didn't claim to understand every ritual, but he understood what it meant to defend home. And this land, though it had never spoken his name, now echoed it in the wind. At night, the drums returned, not loud, not frantic, but steady. They pulsed like the beat of a horse in motion, reminding everyone who heard them that time moved forward, and they must move with it. Nia often walked beside Trace during these moments, saying little, her presence a constant he hadn't known he needed. They didn't speak of love, didn't speak of promises. But when she placed her hand on his back as he watched the ridgeline, it felt like the future was being written in their silence. One evening, a scout returned breathless. A new camp had been spotted 2 ridges over. Boone was back, and he wasn't alone. At least 20 men, some with badges, most without honor. Trace called a council. They didn't panic. They planned. This wasn't just a fight for one man's freedom. It was a stand against a story that had played out too many times before, one of erasure, of theft, of forgetting. This time, they would not be forgotten. As the fire burned low and plans were drawn in the dust, Trace looked around at the circle of faces, young and old, warrior and elder, each with eyes full of stories not yet finished. And somewhere deep inside him, the last bit of loneliness cracked and fell away. He had come into the valley a ghost, content to be forgotten. But now, he was part of something larger. Not just a tribe, not just a family, a history, and a future, written by choice, by courage, and by a blanket laid gently over a stranger in the cold. The morning before the storm came was deceptively quiet. The valley seemed to hold its breath. Even the horses moved slower, as if their hooves knew not to stir the earth too loudly. Trace stood atop the ridge, glassing the horizon with narrowed eyes. He spotted them, just beyond the dry creek, Boone's men assembling near the canyon mouth. No banners, no signals, just rifles and cold intention. But Trace saw more than weapons. He saw fear. Men who had come for a bounty, but now realized they were walking into something they didn't understand. Back at the camp, the tribe had formed a protective ring, not to trap but to hold. The elders sat at the center, whispering prayers and burning sage that spiraled upward like threads reaching toward something ancient. The women moved with urgency and grace, tending fires, sharpening blades, painting symbols of strength across the warriors' arms. Nia stood beside them, her hair braided, her face marked with red and white. She did not look afraid. She looked ready. Trace walked through them, nodding to each face, exchanging quiet glances that said what words could not. He had ridden with killers. He had seen what fear did to men. But this wasn't fear. This was resolve. The kind only born when a people have nothing left to lose and everything left to defend. At the edge of the camp, a young boy placed a carved stone in Trace's hand, a bear etched with a sun. "For strength," the boy said. Trace placed it in his pocket and nodded once. By mid-morning, the dust rose again, not from scouts, but from the full force. Boone rode at the front, flanked by hired guns and former deputies with greedy eyes. They stopped just short of the sacred boundary, unsure whether to cross. "We just want him," Boone called out, voice carrying over the field. "Give us Trace, and we'll leave the rest." Trace stepped forward, rifle across his back, knife sheathed at his hip. "I already gave you my answer," he said, "and you didn't listen." Then the wind changed, the kind of shift that precedes something bigger than man. The tribe stood without a word, forming a wall of bodies, of belief. Boone's men hesitated, and that hesitation cracked the illusion of power. Trace looked back at Nia, her gaze steady, then faced the line once more. "This land remembers what you did," he said, "and it's not going to forget again. You want to write history in blood, but out here, we write it in fire and truth." And with that, the valley prepared to speak. The first shot never came. Instead, it was the sound of hooves, dozens of them, not from Boone's side, but from the west ridge. A second line of warriors appeared, faces painted in ceremonial black, shields strapped to their backs. They were from a neighboring tribe, one not seen in that valley for years. But they had come, not for war, but for witness. Word had spread that something sacred was being challenged. And in the West, when something sacred is threatened, silence does not mean weakness. It means fury is waiting. Boone's men shifted uneasily, the numbers no longer in their favor. One of them stepped forward, raising a pistol, only to be met by the stare of 3 archers with arrows already drawn. Boone barked orders, but his voice lacked force now. He had come expecting submission. Instead, he found unity, not the kind built by law or force, but the kind forged in fire, song, and memory. And Trace, once a man with no name, now stood as the center of it all, no longer silent, no longer wandering. "I came here to disappear," Trace said, stepping between the 2 lines. "But this place didn't let me. It saw me, and I saw it. I saw her. And when a man sees something worth protecting, he doesn't back down. Not for a price, not for a threat, not for the ghost chasing him." Boone spat in the dirt. "You think these people will save you?" Trace shook his head. "I don't need saving. I need standing. And they already taught me how to do that." One of Boone's men lowered his weapon. Then another. A few turned their horses and left without a word, as if the wind itself had spoken to their conscience. Boone watched them go, eyes narrowing, fingers twitching over his revolver. But he didn't draw. He knew. The battle was already over. Not in bullets. In belief. He had come for a bounty. He found a home too deep to break. And so, with nothing left but pride, he turned his horse and rode away, slower than he came, but wiser than he arrived. That night, no blood was spilled, but something else was broken, the chain of silence, the pattern of running, the idea that a man couldn't change. The tribe held a fire, not to celebrate war, but to honor what had been protected. Trace sat beside Nia, her head resting lightly on his shoulder, and for the first time in his long, hard life, he felt what few men ever truly feel in the West. Peace, not as a moment, but as a place. A place he had earned not by fighting, but by staying. The valley breathed easier in the days that followed. Smoke from the fires curled upward not as warnings, but as songs of gratitude. Children ran free between tents and trees, laughter filling spaces once marked by tension. The land, always watching, now felt alive, softened, healed in places where silence had once festered. Trace walked among the people like a man reborn, not as a savior or a leader, but as one of their own. He carried no title. He wore no badge. Yet when he passed, people nodded with respect that words could never match. Nia moved beside him as naturally as the wind. They spoke often, but never needed many words. Sometimes, she would take his hand without a reason. Other times, they'd sit by the river for hours, saying nothing, watching the water carry leaves downstream. It wasn't romance in the way Trace had imagined as a younger man, wild and fiery. It was deeper, quieter, a sense of belonging, like her spirit had always been woven into the place his soul had spent years searching for. One evening, an elder approached with a bundle wrapped in woven cloth. Inside was a blanket, not Trace's old one, but a new one, handmade with sacred symbols, red clay dye, and black thread. The elder laid it across Trace's shoulders. "Now, you carry all of us," he said. Trace didn't speak. He simply nodded, feeling the weight of that fabric settle into something far heavier than wool. It wasn't just a gift. It was a sign. The tribe had accepted him not as a visitor, not even as Nia's husband, but as a pillar of their story. Later that night, around the fire, stories were told again. But this time, they included Trace. How he stopped when most would ride past. How he stood when others would run. How a simple gesture, a blanket shared in the cold, had echoed into the hearts of 300 warriors. The children listened with wide eyes, as if watching a legend form right in front of them. Trace listened too, humbled, as though hearing his life through someone else's voice for the first time. But even in peace, the West does not sleep. The wind still carried whispers from other valleys, places not yet healed, people still waiting for someone to see them. And Trace, though he had found a home, knew that the fire they'd lit in this land had not burned its last. He had once wandered without direction. Now, he walked with purpose, not to save, not to fight, but to remind the forgotten that even in the harshest places, compassion is still a force mightier than steel. Seasons turned like the pages of an unwritten book. Snow fell, then melted. Grass grew tall, then turned gold in the sun. The valley remained strong, but never still. Life pulsed through it, children becoming warriors, elders becoming memory, and Trace becoming something he never imagined. A root. Deep, quiet, steady. He worked the land with his hands. He led the hunts. He stood beside the council not because he asked to, but because they knew he would speak when it mattered, and remain silent when it meant more. The outside world didn't forget him. Occasionally, travelers passed through with news from nearby towns. Boone was gone, vanished into legend or regret. Posters had stopped circulating. The bounty had faded like the ink on the parchment. No one was looking for Trace anymore. But even if they were, they wouldn't find him. Not because he was hiding, but because he was no longer that man. The drifter with the hollow heart was gone. In his place stood something rarer in the West than gold, a man at peace. Nia gave birth in spring. The whole tribe gathered under the stars as her cries broke into the wind, and when the child came, a girl with quiet eyes and a strong grip, the elders sang through the night. They named her Taya, which meant blessing that stays. Trace held her for the first time with hands that had once only known weapons and reins. Now they held life. Now they held future. He looked at Nia, who smiled at him with tears that needed no translation. "You gave her a name before she was born," she whispered. "When you gave me your warmth." Taya grew fast, like the trees that surrounded the valley. And as she walked, learned, and laughed, Trace saw pieces of himself in her. Not the broken parts, but the pieces he had never let himself believe could last. He watched her chase birds across the field and thought of the girl by the fire, wrapped in his old blanket. That one night had given him everything he never thought he deserved. Not because he was brave, but because he had stopped and stayed. And so, the loner cowboy who once rode through silence with no name of his own became a chapter in a story older than time. Not carved in stone or shouted in saloons, but whispered from mother to child, carried in wind and fire, retold every time someone asked, "Where did our story begin?" The answer was always the same. It began when one man saw the cold and chose to cover it with his own warmth. Years passed like the slow, sacred rhythm of a drumbeat echoing through the canyon walls. Trace's hair grayed, his back stiffened, but his presence never faded. He became the kind of man others looked to not for orders, but for steadiness, like a mountain that had always been there, watching. Taya grew into a fierce and graceful soul. Her spirit split between her father's quiet strength and her mother's burning purpose. She ran with the warriors, asked the elders hard questions, and carried in her eyes the memory of a fire that had once shaped them all. Visitors still came, traders, wanderers, and even a few settlers lost in the mountains, drawn not by maps, but by the stories passed from valley to town, from campfire to trail. They spoke of the man who had once been hunted, who now walked unarmed among warriors and wolves. Some came looking for answers. Some came for peace. All of them left different than they arrived. Trace greeted them the same way he had once been greeted, not with suspicion, but with stillness. A man who had nothing to prove, and everything to offer if you listen close enough. One summer evening, Taya asked her father why he never left the valley. "You rode so far once," she said. "Why didn't you keep riding?" Trace smiled slowly and looked across the open land, golden in the dusk. Because sometimes the trail ends, and you realize it wasn't the end. It was the beginning, he said. I thought I was meant to be alone. But this land, this family, it taught me the difference between surviving and living. He paused, placing a hand on her shoulder. And it all started because I stopped. Just once. The tribe had built a ceremonial arch at the center of the valley. Every year, they gathered beneath it to tell the story of the man who became their brother. Not to idolize him, but to remember why it mattered. Because in the harsh law of the West, kindness was often mistaken for weakness. But that story, the blanket in the cold, the warriors at dawn, the stand without violence, proved that strength could come from gentleness. That a man's legacy could be shaped not by bloodshed, but by a single, quiet decision to care. And so, even as Trace's steps slowed and his voice softened, the legend only grew stronger. He was no longer just a figure in the firelight. He was a root in the earth, a name spoken in reverence. And long after his boots stopped walking, long after his hands no longer held tools or rifles, his story would ride on in the hearts of those who heard it. Not as a tale of war, but as a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is to stay. The final winter he saw came in heavy, blanketing the valley in snow so thick it muffled every sound but the crackle of firewood and the soft footsteps of those still tending the land. Trace spent his days near the hearth now, a warm drink in his hands, Taya and Nia always nearby. He didn't speak much, but his silence had weight. When he did offer words, they came like the wind, slow, cold, and full of meaning. He spoke not of battles, but of moments, not of regrets, but of the lessons hidden in stillness. The elders gathered around him often, asking his thoughts not as a formality, but as tradition. You were the bridge, one of them told him, between two paths that were never meant to meet, and yet you stood in the middle and let them cross. Trace nodded, humbled. He had never seen himself as anything more than a man who had once made a decision with his heart instead of his fear. But over time, he understood, in a place where every small choice could shape generations, that had been enough. One morning, he sat beneath the tree where he had once watched the sun rise alone. Taya sat beside him, now a woman of her own strength, and asked, "What would you do different if you could go back?" Trace looked out over the land, the fire circles, the river, the trails carved by memory. "Nothing," he said. "Every mistake brought me here. Every silence, every scar. Even the wandering was part of the map." He placed her hand over his chest. "I rode a long time to find home, but I didn't realize I was home until I gave it to someone else." That night, the fire burned longer than usual. The tribe gathered without knowing why. Perhaps they felt in the wind, perhaps in the weight of the stars. When dawn came, Trace's seat was empty, but no one cried. Instead, they wrapped the sacred blanket, now faded and mended with time, and placed it upon the altar, not to say goodbye, but to remember that warmth could shape a man's destiny. And so the story lives on, of the cowboy who once rode alone and laid his only comfort upon a stranger, who never asked for love, but found it, who never sought a tribe, but became one. In a world that often writes its heroes in blood, this one was written in silence, firelight, and a blanket shared in the cold. In a land where stories are carved into dust and memory fades faster than names on stone, one man rewrote his fate with something simpler than a gun or a war cry. He offered warmth. Not to win, not to prove, but because he saw someone in need and acted. Trace didn't seek legend. He didn't ask for loyalty or legacy. Yet his silence became a symbol, his stillness a stand. And through one quiet moment by a dying fire, 300 warriors found a reason to rise, not for revenge, but for honor. His journey reminds us that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives in a whisper, in the choice to stop, to help, to stay. In a world built on noise and speed, Trace's story is a reminder that the most powerful impact often comes from presence. He didn't speak much. He didn't have to. His life became the message. A message that says, you don't need to be a hero to matter. You just need to see the person in front of you and care enough to act. And isn't that what we're all searching for? Not perfection, but purpose. Not applause, but meaning. Trace was a drifter, shaped by loss, marked by solitude. But the moment he gave what little he had, he received everything he never knew he needed: love, belonging, and a place that called his name without asking him to change. That kind of transformation doesn't come through force. It comes through choice. And it begins with one question: will you stop when the world tells you to ride on? Let this story settle in your heart like firelight after the storm. Let it challenge you to pay attention to the quiet moments, because that's where real legacy is born. Out here in the West, and in life, the measure of a person isn't how far they ride, but what they do when someone else is cold. That's what people remember. That's what changes everything. If this story moved you, if it lit something inside you worth keeping, then stay close. Subscribe to the channel, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this with someone who still believes in quiet courage. Because maybe the West isn't gone. Maybe it's waiting for someone like you to keep the fire alive.